What voting method should you push for? For me, it's not about what the best method is, it's more about what can realistically be achieved in the fastest amount of time. Specifically, I'm looking for two different criterias. 1. Can you vote honestly for your favorite candidate without negative consequence? And 2. Can it break the two-party system? First, let's locate the source of the problem. The reason we have a two-party system is because of the mathematics behind our first-past-the-post system. Plurality voting is when one person gets one vote and the person with the simple majority always wins. This might seem like an alright way to vote, but this inevitably leads to a two-party system. The problem is the spoiler effect, where votes end up taking away from the other like-minded candidates. This leads to scenarios where the majority might like certain policies, but too many candidates on the similar side of the spectrum end up taking votes from each other, therefore making the more solidified minority opposition win. As a result, the smartest thing voters can do is to not vote for their favorite candidate, and to instead to vote for who they think is most likely to win in order to prevent the least liked candidate from winning. This obviously leads to a lot of voter apathy, as people can't freely express the person that they truly want, and instead have to settle with the person they think can beat out the worst candidates. What happens is that candidates create alliances to avoid taking each other's votes. They agree to share some policies so that a single candidate with a shared platform can amass enough votes to win the elections. When their opposition catches wind of this, they create their own counter-alliance, which inevitably leads to a two-party system. Hence, where picking the lesser of the two evils has become a staple of American politics. A common proposal to fix this problem has been to adopt ranked voting in order to break the spoiler effect. But, I'm making this video to show you that ranked voting does not actually break the spoiler effect and creates the illusion of progress without actually improving anything. Instead, I'd like to propose approval voting as a simpler and easier method with a higher positive impact to our election process in order to reduce the power of the two-party system. First, a quick rundown of how each system works. Ranked voting is when you rank your candidates from most to least liked. Least liked candidates are eliminated in earlier rounds, with the next choice being carried over to the preceding rounds. This process of elimination is continued until the most liked candidate wins the election. Approval voting is where you can say yes to as many candidates as you'd like, and the most liked candidate will always win. So is ranked voting better than approval voting, and does it break the two-party system? No, it does not. Ranked voting might seem better because you can show preference among candidates, but the benefits to showing who you like most hides the reality that ranked voting doesn't actually eliminate the spoiler effect, and vote splitting still exists in the final round just as it does for plurality voting. This ultimately leads to a maintenance of the two-party system and does nothing to really alleviate the problems that plurality voting carries. Allow me to demonstrate. Let's say one of the three finalists are a majority-like candidate, and the other two are extremes at the opposite ends of the spectrum. Well, the majority-like candidate has the approval of the most people, but he's also everyone's second choice. So while he had the widest appeal among the most people, he ultimately loses for not being the first choice for more people. This leads to results the same as vote splitting, except it occurs in the later rounds instead of the first rounds like plurality voting does. Because putting your favorite candidate first might end up making your least liked candidate win in the final round. The smartest thing you can therefore do is to not vote for your favorite candidate, and to instead vote for who you think will win in the final round. AKA, vote for someone that you can tolerate instead of someone that you actually like. In other words, vote for the lesser of the two evils. In other words, this is exactly the same as plurality voting, except with extra rounds in between. Most importantly, if you do ranked voting for a long period of time, you'll ultimately still get a two-party system, and it will do nothing to actually weaken the two-party system that we currently have. Just look at Australia for instance. Australia has had ranked voting for almost 100 years, and yet they still have a two-party majority system. The duopoly isn't there because of laws hindering third parties. The reason it exists is because vote splitting still happens within a ranked voting system. Let's pretend America is a new country, and they don't have two major parties yet. They start off with ranked voting, and groups of people soon realize that the best way to get their platform to win is to pump out as many candidates as possible to try and get more candidates in the final round. So, coalitions form. Some candidates promise to adopt each other's policy, so that more shared interest candidates can reach the final stages of the ranked voting system. This way, if one person in the coalition wins, they still get their policies passed. Over time, the losers catch wind of this, and they do the exact same thing from the opposite end of the spectrum. Now we have a two-party system within a ranked voting system. Two parties agreeing to support carbon copy candidate clones to avoid vote splitting in the final round. This creates the two-party duopoly problem altogether again, except with the added illusion that progress has been made when in reality, nothing has changed. If you really want to break up the two-party system in America, prioritizing approval voting is the best way to go. Right now we've been talking about the spoiler effect, which leads to strategic voting, which prevents you from voting for the candidates that you actually like. The problem is called the criteria of independence of irrelevant alternatives. The term states, adding more candidates in the field should not hinder you from picking your preferred choice, aka voting for the lesser of the two evils by rejecting your preferred candidate should not be a thing. Approval voting alleviates this because voting for unlikely candidates won't hinder the chances of other candidates you prefer. There's no fear that voting for the wrong candidate will help the least liked candidate win. It's true you can't really show who you prefer the most in ascending order like you can with ranked voting, but this is a worthy sacrifice by the simple fact that it absolves any benefits there are to two-party coalition building. Under ranked and plurality voting, there's no reason to appeal to everyone when you only need the bare minimum amount of votes to win. There's no reason to waste time and resources trying to appeal to everyone when you're better off aiming at specific, non-contradicting voting blocks in order to reach the finish line. Approval voting absolves all of this because if everyone can vote for as many people as they want, there's no longer a benefit to appealing to specific blocks, and there is now a greater incentive to try and appeal to a wider overlapping margin of people with varying interests. What you'd end up seeing is more candidates with mixed platforms from the major parties, and more people willing to run on singular issues without fear of helping the worst candidates to win. Ranked voting might seem like it's more efficient than approval voting, but this is an analogy very similar to coding. Just because something has a lot more steps in order to complete it, it doesn't mean the coding itself is a lot better. In fact, simplicity is highly praised within the coding community because you want to be able to get the fastest, most efficient results as quickly as possible, and less steps is a lot better in your system when you're writing out the instructions. Or to use layman's term, just because the commercial brand razor has a lot of blades to it, it doesn't mean it's any better than the single blade razor that you use to shave your face and legs. In fact, the single blade razor tends to be way better than the multi-blade razor, simply because of its simplicity, with the added razors being more a marketing ploy than anything that's really tangibly beneficial. Wanna know what else is a marketing ploy? Brand name medicines. Generic brands often carry the exact same ingredients as name brand medicines, but are also cheaper and safer than big brand products. Having more promotions and technicalities does not make ranked voting superior to approval voting. And there are more reasons to support approval voting than just the practicality reasons. Arguably, approval voting can be implemented much sooner and earlier than ranked voting can be, by the simple fact that it requires less political capital to pass than ranked voting does. There's a term called political capital, which is basically defined as the resources, energy, and time needed to achieve a political policy-making decision. The way this works is, the more political capital that's needed to pass something, the harder it is to make that happen. The less political capital needed to pass something, the easier it is to make that happen. I understand more people right now are invested in ranked voting system, but not only does it not help against the two-party system, but it also requires a lot more political capital than approval voting does. I'll give you 3 reasons why approval voting is faster to implement and more likely and easier to implement than ranked voting. And the reasons are 1. Easier implementation, 2. Simpler for the public to understand, and 3. Less political backlash from the two major parties. 1. Implementation. Changing ballots takes a lot of time and money to start. To have to reprogram electronic counting machines while changing ballots from box ballots to numbered ballots. Switching from plurality to voting is much easier because nothing in the programming of ballot machines is actually changed. You simply remove the 1 vote limit to make it limitless. It is estimated that ranked voting can cost anywhere from double to 10 times the cost compared to what an approval voting transition is. Sources linked down below. More money means more resources are required. More resources means more effort it is to get this passed and approved. Therefore, approval voting is easier and cheaper to implement in the United States on a widespread scale. 2. Simplicity. If you search YouTube videos for potential flaws in ranked voting, the most commonly mentioned problem is that it's very difficult to understand. Most people watching my video right now who have heard of ranked voting understand that that argument is pretty much hogwash. Ranked voting is fairly easy to understand, and that's not really a strong point against it. And if it did what it claims to do, then it would be a worthwhile endeavor anyways. The bigger critique is that it doesn't actually do what it claims to do, which is why I'm making this video in the first place, as a real, legitimate criticism of the ranked voting system. However, there is truth that pushing for more complicated ideas does make it harder to appeal to a wider margin of masses. Just to give you a visual, imagine for a moment you're part of a school faculty board, trying to decide where your funding should go. And in order to get approval of your funds, you have to explain where your funds are going to go in the first place. What do you think is going to be easier for donors to understand? Either A, we need this money so that we can build more computers for students, or B, we need this money to completely change the curriculum of our school to have a more logic and critically thinking based curriculum in order to make our students think outside the box and think less in terms of test taking standards and more in terms of real world application. The curriculum change is probably going to have the most positive benefits. However, people aren't typically quick to support the more complicated solutions. It's easier to support a policy that says A equals B, we have money, let's build computers, versus A equals B equals C equals D, we need to change this, then that, so that we get this result. The more complicated a solution is, the less likely people are to support that solution, while the simpler solutions tend to be the easiest to gain approval of. So in terms of implementation, the complications that ranked voting carries with it is actually a hindrance keeping it from getting passed. A hindrance which approval voting does not have. And last but not least, political parties don't realize that approval voting is worse for them. In 2019, the governor of California vetoed a bill for ranked voting in the state. And the reasons were pretty obvious. California is a solid blue state, so why support a bill that might break your party's rule? And this is true for both red and blue states alike. If your state is staunchly one party, what benefit is there for those politicians to support a voting system which has explicitly been marketed as something that will break the two-party system? The irony, of course, is that ranked voting doesn't actually break the two-party system, but it does sell itself as it will. Meanwhile, when pitching approval voting, the selling point typically isn't that it breaks the two-party system. The selling point is that we should be able to show everyone we support without fear of wasting our votes. So in a roundabout sort of way, more politicians are against ranked voting despite it not really threatening their parties. Meanwhile, approval voting threatens the two parties much more, but politicians don't really oppose it because they don't see it as a threat. What we have is a golden opportunity. Less political capital and less political resistance is needed to push for approval voting for the maximum positive reform results. The reason I made this video is to encourage you all to push for approval voting in your local county. While I typically support any type of election reform, approval voting is going to be the fastest thing that can be passed over the next few years. Congress is just too gridlocked to pass any federal election reform, so this happening on a local level is far more likely to succeed. Ranked voting could take a decade to implement everywhere, but approval voting can happen as early as your next local election, and I really want widespread approval voting to happen before our next presidential election. ElectionScience.org is a national campaign which pushes for approval voting in a county-by-county level. They have organizers and local meetups, and they discuss how approval can be passed in each specific area. Please, if you really want election reform to end our two-party system, sign up for Election Science's email list so that you can get information on how you can campaign for this in your local area. Depending on how your local county is structured, there are different specifications needed to get this passed locally. I really do believe that ranked voting is a long shot, and also a shot in all the wrong places. Approval voting is easier, speedier, and more beneficial than ranked voting can be, so please, sign up and donate if you can. They need as many members as possible. I hope you all enjoyed this video and found it beneficial. Axel, logging out.